Well, it's time to bring in our first guest.
We do. Joining us live on Skype, we have lawyer Kirk Tousaw.
Yeah, founding board member of Sensible BC Society, serves on the board of directors of Normal Canada and the BC Civil Liberties Association. As I mentioned off the top, Kirk's testified in Ottawa in front of numerous standing committees. Kirk, thanks very much for doing this. We appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
No, and let me just ask you first off, just because it's interesting that so much of your practice now focuses on cannabis and the upcoming legalization and everything that kind of goes around it. How did you get involved in the first place? Was that something you thought about in law school, or did you just kind of stumble into it?
Well, I've been a fan of the plant all of my adult life, and it's been, sort of a constant companion to me, which resulted in, some situations involving the criminal justice system, and sort of that propelled me into some activism and advocacy. I didn't plan on necessarily going in this direction when I went to law school. I sort of went to law school because I had a political philosophy degree and wasn't really sure I wanted to continue and go on and teach or do something like that. I went to law school, did a few years of civil practice in a big firm, some criminal law as well, because that's what I was really interested in. And then family decided to sort of escape the United States in 2002. I'm a dual citizen, so we moved to Vancouver. I got involved with the BC Civil Liberties Association, went back to UBC, and got a master's in law. And there I did write about cannabis prohibition. So I wrote a thesis on the Senate report, and at the time, the Supreme Court of Canada had just decided the Malma Levine case, along with Randy Kane and Chris Clay. As an aside, I've now represented all three of those people over the years, and that's been a real privilege. But I wrote my thesis about that case and the criminalization of cannabis here in Canada. Fell in with John Conroy and Mark Emery and the folks at Cannabis Culture Headquarters. Went to work for the BC Marijuana Party while being admitted to practice law in BC. And in fact, I had wrapped up the provincial election campaign in 2005 for the BC Marijuana Party, and had done my sort of law review course that summer. And the day I took my bar exam, July 25, 2005, sort of, you have your cell phones off, you're in taking this exam all day. And I walked out with my law school compatriots ready to go celebrate, and turned on my cell phone. And my cell phone was just blowing up. I was getting calls from every media outlet, and I answer one, and it's the CBC, and they want a comment from the BC Marijuana Party on the Drug Enforcement Administration raids at its headquarters and the arrests of Mark Emery and Greg Williams and Michelle Rainey. And I sort of, said, well, I'll have to call you back.
Yeah, I would think so.
I have a different call to make first, yeah.
Handed off my goodie bag to my buddy and said, go out to the bar, have a good time. I've got to go and sort of get to work. And that was the day they arrested Mark and Greg and Michelle, and it's just sort of been nonstop ever since.
Wow.
When you think about that and the times at the beginning, to where we are now on the the eve, I guess you could say, of July 1st and legalization in Canada, it seemed for the longest time it was a non-starter, and it seemed mostly because of concern about our neighbors to the south. But once you saw the first crack, and the first state, whether it was Colorado or whether it was Washington, I can't remember. But that seemed to change the conversation completely. Are you surprised, considering the career-long fight you've been in as far as advocacy goes, that we're this close to legalization?
Part of me wants to say yes, and part of me wants to say no to that question. People forget, but it was only 5 years ago, in 2012, when law reform on the cannabis file was in front of the Parliament, but it was to implement mandatory jail terms for producing as few as 6 plants. Lengthy jail terms for producing more than that on a mandatory basis, all kinds of repressive legislation. I mean, things were pretty grim. If you'd asked me in 2012, would we be talking about legalizing cannabis in 5 short years, I think I would have laughed at you. I'd say we're still going to be fighting the battles in court arising from this terrible piece of legislation that the Harper government's implemented. So in that sense, I'm kind of gobsmacked. On the other hand, the public has been ahead of politicians on this issue for more than a decade. A majority of Canadians have supported legalization for a very long time. It's been studied to death here in Canada by royal commissions from Ledane in the 70s to the Senate report in 2002, and a parallel but briefer report done in the House right around the same time. And everybody that's ever looked at this and paid any attention to the evidence says we should be legalizing cannabis. So, I'm an optimist. I like to think that facts do matter from time to time, even in government, and that good public policy sometimes prevails over politics. So I'm very happy that we're on the brink of legalization. There's work yet to be done. Like any evolutionary process, the evolution of how we're going to go about dealing with cannabis going forward is it doesn't stop July 1, 2018. I've heard it called Prohibition 2.0, and I understand where that perspective comes from. I like to think of it as legalization 1.0, and it's a step that we can take now and then continue to take more steps towards the system that I think all Canadians would benefit from.
So you're a part of, you've kind of been in the Senate, I guess, right? And sitting and being a part of the bill that's happening right now. Can you tell us your thoughts on where it's going and how it's where it's at right now in the state of it?
Yeah, so as you know, the Bill C-45 has passed third reading, so it's gone over to the Senate for consideration. So in our parliamentary system, the Senate will do its deliberations on it, and will either make amendments to it or not, and then send it back to the House for royal assent, basically, and then passing in the law. Some have speculated the Senate may hold that up. I don't think they will. I think the will of Canadians is pretty clear on this. I think the legislation, there are places it needs to be amended, for sure. I think that, for example, on the personal side of things, the idea that you're a criminal for growing 5 plants and not 4, or you're a criminal if you live in a house of 4 adults and you each grow 4 plants, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's arbitrary and quite likely to be unconstitutional. I think having a 30-gram limit when you can fill up your trunk with enough alcohol to kill a small town doesn't make any sense at all. We shouldn't be treating cannabis more strictly than we treat alcohol. Let's treat it at least as leniently as we treat alcohol, and actually probably more leniently because it's way safer. So those are places we need to do some work. Certainly the per se alcohol limits that are in Bill C-46 and some of the provincial legislation are completely unconstitutional, will be challenged on day one, deeply discriminate against medical consumers. And of course, we shouldn't be taxing medicine at all. In fact, we should be covering those costs for Canadians that use it for, as your next guest, I'm sure we'll talk about, post-traumatic stress disorder and other serious chronic or acute health conditions. But, at the end of the day, we are going to legalize cannabis. You're going to be able to, ordinary Canadians are going to be able to go into stores and buy it, possess it, and in a year from then, hash and edibles will be on the shelves. It's a momentous step forward, and we should be justifiably proud that as Canadians we are taking this step. And it looks like the future is going to be better than the past. That's for sure.
Now, do you think because I guess the two main things are keeping the black market out of things and also keeping it out of the hands of children. Do you think by the rules that they're putting in place right now that, like the restriction of provinces and things like that, do you think that's going to actually kind of bring the black market back into play?
I think the black market or the gray market of dispensaries will go away over time as the legal market begins to be able to compete on price, on customer service, on quality, and on variety of products. And that's going to be the big sticking point. When you only have flower and sort of low potency cannabis oil available on day one legally, people that like concentrates, people that like vape pens, people that like edibles or drinkables are left out. Those products can only exist in the black market, and people are going to go there and get them. And I think the government's recognized that. It's actually, if you look at the most recent consultation document that all Canadians should read and comment on before January 20. That's the deadline. Have your say, please. Let the government know your preferences, either as growers or consumers or distributors or industry participants or parents or whatever the case may be. have your say. That's what democracy is. But if you look at that document, it very explicitly recognizes that the licit industry has to compete with a very vibrant, thriving, and well-run, frankly, illicit industry, most of which is not organized crime domestically, most of which is ordinary Canadians, small business people and entrepreneurs just growing and making great products and getting it in the hands of people that really, really want it. But over time, the goal, I think, should be to transition those people out of the illicit industry, bring them out of the shadows, bring them into the light, make it easy for them to participate legally. The provinces that have enacted really restrictive rules on retail, the monopolies on retail that you're seeing in Ontario and Quebec in particular, which are frankly outliers at this point in what we know about what the provinces are going to do, that's not going to work very well. That's not what people want. That's not what people are accustomed to. That's not how you transition the industry. If you're going to try to compete against the black market, you're not going to do very well, at least in the short term. And I think we need to be a little more open to welcoming in the people that are doing this job really, really well right now, and bringing them, as I say, out of the shadows. That should be the goal.
Kirk, you mentioned just every province is kind of enact their own rules depending on how they see things, and it seems so far a lot of them are just following what they do with the Liquor Control Board in their province.
Right.
It's strange just because it's going to be different rules in different parts of the country, and I'm wondering, there's a case right now that I guess the Supreme Court's going to decide on dealing with moving alcohol between provinces, where a gentleman, and again, bought his alcohol, I believe, in Quebec and took it back to New Brunswick, and all of a sudden he's going, no, there's a limit on how much you can bring. It's within the country. Will that case have any effect, do you think, on people buying mail-order cannabis and things from across the country?
Well, I certainly hope it will. I am acting on behalf of Cannabis Culture, which itself is representing a group of 27 other dispensaries that filed for intervention in that case, and we were granted intervention by the Supreme Court of Canada. And so we'll be making arguments next week, actually, on December 7th. The case is on December 6th and 7th. You can watch it on the internet if people are interested. It's the Comeau case, Comeau. And you're right, the facts involve Mr. Comeau, who crossed the bridge in his hometown and went and purchased some alcohol over in Quebec where it was a bit cheaper. He brought back more than the 12 bottles of beer he was entitled to. I think he had 48. And it was all for his own personal consumption. And the police were doing a sting operation on the bridge, pulling people over and handing out tickets. And he has managed to bring that case from the very lowest rung of the court system in our country, the initial lower level trial court, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, which will decide whether Section 121 of the Canadian Constitution, which prohibits interprovincial trade barriers, or appears to, is implicated by that kind of law. And what we've argued on behalf of Cannabis Culture and the other interveners, the other dispensaries, is that, look, these provincial monopolies, these ways of doing things that restrict, for example, someone in Ontario to purchase only from Ontario stores, and you can't, for example, think about it. You could cross the border over to Quebec, where the consumption age will be a year younger. Of course, that happens now for alcohol. And if you bring it back, then you run into trouble. We think these kinds of trade barriers within the provinces and between the provinces don't make a lot of sense. And ultimately, all the interveners that have come in on Mr. Comeau's side, the craft wine, the craft beer associations, have said, look, these rules stifle our industry, and they stifle the ability of Canadians to have the broadest range of selection possible of goods that are legal and permissible for them to purchase. And certainly that should apply to cannabis as well.
No, a lot of eyes will be on that case. Any questions from our viewers for Kirk?
We do have some questions. One is from Christian in Thunder Bay. And he asks, I've heard that Kirk is booked solid with clients. Where can I find a cannabis lawyer to help me become a licensed producer?
Well, Christian, thanks very much. That's very kind of you. I don't do, frankly, even that kind of work. I have not been involved at all directly in licensed producer applications. It's kind of regulatory compliance stuff that has never been something I've been particularly interested in. And so I think there are good teams out there. There are, I think your first stop might not be a lawyer. It might be one of the organizations that consult with prospective LPs. David Hyde's a guy that I interact with on Twitter a lot, and he's got a team that assists. There's Cannabis Compliance Incorporated, I think, is out there. So there's a fair bit of resources providing assistance to people that want to go that route. And certainly with the advent now of micro producers coming and microprocessors, nurseries, research applications, a broader range of things you can apply for licenses are coming. That's part of the consultation document. I think this will be more and more navigable for ordinary Canadians, and certainly that's the way it should be.
I have a hunch more and more people will get into the business of providing consulting services once everything is kind of above board.
Sure.
We do have one more question.
One more, okay, sure.
Leslie in Red Deer asks, how accessible do you think the recently announced micro license will be for craft growers and entrepreneurs? She's concerned that the financial and security requirements could prohibit fair participation.
Yeah, and I think Leslie echoes concerns that a lot of people have been voicing, and that's part of why the government's doing this consultation. I mean, I think the good thing is that if you read the consultation document, the government, picking up on suggestions from the task force, has said, look, in order to have the vibrant industry that will assist in transitioning people away from the illicit market, we need to have the ability of Canadians and small business to participate. And that's the intent in creating these licensing categories. The devil will be in the details, absolutely. That's why it's important for people to have their say. But I do think it will be accessible. Now, it's gonna take, like all things do, all regulated industries do, it's gonna take some money, it's gonna take some capital, it's gonna take some hard work. And whether that acts as a barrier to keep many people out is going to be anybody's guess. I certainly hope not. I don't think it should cost a lot of money to have a small cannabis farm. And I think the provinces can help that out by making sure that within their own retail regulatory schemes, they're allowing these craft producers to sell direct to the consumer, like you would in a vineyard or in a craft brew location. So down the street from my house here in the Cowichan Valley, British Columbia, I can go to a vineyard, I can sample their wine, I can buy wine directly from that vintner and take it home. I can go to my local craft brewery, Red Arrow in Duncan, I can have a sampler on site, I can sit on their porch in the summer and have a beer, and I can buy it directly from them in keg, in bottle and can format, and I can take it right home. If that exists provincially for craft cannabis, I think it makes participation so much easier for small business, because you don't need to produce so much that you interest the big provincial monopolies in purchasing from you. And that's, I think, part of the lobbying that has to go on over the next year. And after that, like I say, this is a process. We're 100 years at the end of alcohol prohibition, and people are still fighting against silly alcohol rules, as we'll be doing in the Supreme Court of Canada next week. So I'm optimistic, but Leslie's right. Work remains to be done, and those are real issues.
Kirk, listen, we're out of time. We really appreciate you spending some of your afternoon with us. We appreciate it tremendously.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks very much, and anytime. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
You.
That's Kirk Tousaw again. It's the Tousaw Law Corporation.